Guys, can you hear me okay? Is everyone hearing me okay?
I think that's it, and we're live. So yeah, all good. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on Secure Access Service Edge, or SASE. My name is David Williams, and I'll be your host today. I head up Telstra's Adaptive Networks proposition for enterprise wide area networking, and I'm joined by two top experts in their field. So Adam Rethor, who heads up our Telstra Purple Security and Networking Professional Services practice in EMEA, and Spencer Branson, who heads up Palo Alto's SASE proposition in EMEA. Welcome, gentlemen. So this webinar lasts for an hour. You're welcome. So this webinar lasts for an hour. We've earmarked the last 10 minutes for Q&A from the audience. So we've got an interesting and diverse set of industries represented in the audience today. So as we're walking through some of the concepts and conversation, if you have any comments or opinions, please do drop that into the general chat function. And if you've got any specific questions, there's a separate tab there for Q&A. If you could put those questions into that Q&A tab, and then we'll come to those at the end of the session. So with that, let's kick into it. So one of my team actually attended WAN Summit in Frankfurt just last week, and he covered a round table on SASE. And what he was saying to me was that over 80% of the vendors that were and service providers that were exhibiting at the events were also promoting SASE. So it's really a topic that is certainly growing and under spotlight in the industry at the moment. But I think it's important to stress that it's not a product; it's an architectural concept. So on this call today, we'll be discussing why enterprises are adopting the SASE architecture for network and security, what value it delivers, and also how best it can be implemented. But before we go into some of those specifics, let's just take 5 minutes to level set in terms of some of the definitions of that acronym. I think for those that have been in networking and this field for a while, you recognize that many of the technologies that comprise the SASE framework are not really new. They've been around for some time, but what Gartner's done is a brilliant job in packaging those up into quite an elegant way. So I'd like to kick off by inviting the panelists to define in their words whether this is genuinely new technology or is more marketing spin. And I might address that first to you, Adam.
Yeah, thanks, David. Morning, everyone. Really interesting question, because as you say, I think most people, when they look at SASE and kind of look at what SASE is comprised of, many of these capabilities are not new. You know, if we especially cast our minds back sort of a decade or so, you know, things like secure web gateways, you know, even CASB, SD-WAN to a degree, you know, they're all components that we're all familiar with, all used to using probably over the last sort of 10 years or so, especially over the last 5 years. But as you say, kind of packaging those together is a unique way of kind of gaining value from those pieces holistically. So I think, you know, the importance for me is, you know, understanding the components which build SASE and why they're connected together. For me, SASE is kind of built of 5 major components, and that really majors on kind of SD-WAN, firewall as a service, so cloud-based firewalling, CASB, secure web gateway, and zero trust network access. But those 5 things seem to be the core things that most customers go to when they want to talk about SASE. But actually, the reality of where customers are in terms of their kind of strategy and implementation, I find it tends to be just 2 or 3 of those pieces to start with. So most organizations are starting out with either the SD-WAN component, maybe the firewall as a service component to help remove on-premise infrastructure, because it's what most organizations want to get to, and the secure web gateway piece. And when we start thinking about other components to build into SASE, you know, they're really kind of value-added options that people start to adopt as they mature through this journey. So I definitely think it's a case of, you know, lots of traditional technology, and, you know, for businesses to adopt all of those things, it's definitely a roadmap for them to start on a journey on.
Thanks, Adam. Spencer, your view?
Well, I think there is really sort of 2 I would say, real trends that we've seen that is actually furthering SASE adoption right now. And I think that if you really look at the explosion since the pandemic in terms of hybrid working, right? So that's obviously be one aspect. But then also if you look at the adoption of cloud, right? So then there what really does sort of we are really looking at is that architecturally it's that convergence of what was traditional in terms of networking and security and how that was delivered. So I think that work now has become an activity, not a place. So when we think about that, and when we think about the way that we secured remote access and the way that we secured internet access, and actually there was quite a lot in scenarios that we've seen over these last few years, whereas access to SaaS applications has now become ever more important. But now we're thinking about how we secure them, how we provide connectivity also. So let's just, if we kind of sort of look at the trends at the present as we see them, and then the challenges around how we deliver networking and security consistently, right? So I have the same set of policy rules, configurations as when I'm in the office as when I'm out of the office, right? And so that obviously therefore does play into what we see as SASE, right? In terms of the architecture, the consistency of how we deliver security, and how we think about access. Who can actually access what within an application, right? What privileges, what rule sets we can set, what that user can actively do, within a said application, I think is becoming ever more important, and we see more and more CISOs thinking about that. But also, I think just one aspect I just would add is, that whole experience piece now is that, when we look at it from a productivity standpoint, right? Working from home, and we've seen over these last few years, the challenge from an operational perspective is that how do I ensure that my users are productive? How do I ensure that applications and access to applications is where I need it to be? Is the performance is as for users where they would be working in an office, and that's also been an important part of terms of SASE and how we think about experience, how we think about SASE, performance for an application, and how we can help IT teams remediate, troubleshoot dynamically when we see a problem. Could be that a user is having issues with a said application, or perhaps connectivity issues in the wider realm. How can we quickly identify that? And so that's actually sort of now become what I see as very fundamental important in terms of when we're speaking about the wider issue and topic of SASE as well. So just like sort of, I agree with Adam. I think, yeah, absolutely, it is absolutely right in terms of that convergence. And what we do see is that it is an evolution. It's not necessarily something that people are sort of taking that whole architectural design today, delivering that tomorrow. It typically is very sort of piecemeal quite still. So very interesting to hear what your perception of it is very similar to what we certainly see as well.
Yeah, thanks for really good insights there. So I think everyone on the call, the audience, hopefully can recognize some of those trends. But what we've seen really is a kind of an acceleration of that, I would say, in the last 12 months or so, as I mentioned from the little anecdote around WAN Summit the other day. So again, probably just to elaborate a little bit more on that point you're making there, Spencer, what do you think are the key drivers that's pushing enterprises to adopt SASE now rather than a few years ago? What's making it such a hot topic at this point?
It's really interesting, and I was talking to business right now, and business is thinking about, if we think about SASE in terms of it being at the branch, and we think about how we deliver networking security, I think every organization is currently going through a reassessment. They're looking at the moment in terms of what they have in terms of real estate, right? How many offices do I need today, given that my users now, it's a mesh between working in offices maybe 2-3 days a week and then working at home for the rest. And so what we are seeing is that there's definitely a change in the shift of how we think about branch-like security and networking, right? In terms of actually people and organizations. And this is typically what organizations are telling us, is that they're now looking for shorter term lease agreements. They are now also looking at perhaps exiting current lease agreements that they have on the long term and they're looking at how they can perhaps provide flexible working models at the branch site, right? So that means that they're looking at managed service builds, just reworks. But what they want from that is their IT to be dynamic. So that literally as a service type models, working with partners such as Telstra and how we can actually deliver, connectivity and, implement that, in a dynamic, scalable fashion, make it very pervasive. How then we can provide SD-WAN as perhaps a route, and then how we can provide security and deliver that as infrastructure as a service type models. So the idea of having very sort of appliance heavy driven networks is becoming kind of, I think, a little bit archaic in thought because of the model that we now see. We want a much more sort of flexible and an agile model when thinking about the future of how the branch and the office will operate. And IT has to be flexible. It has to be, and I think that's where SASE as a concept is certainly helping businesses change the way networking security is delivered at the branch, certainly. But then I think it's that mobile use case as well. It's that kind of consistency. Is that I want to make sure that when users are working in an office, a coffee shop, an airport, wherever, in remote access, I've not got two different rule sets for access and when I'm in the office to application as to when I'm working from home. And that sort of fundamental that is helping to drive zero trust, as for example, as an initiative. And I think again, working with partners like yourself, how you guys are bringing together that whole technology, people, process piece, I think is very, very valuable in the market right now.
Yeah, thanks, Spencer. That's a good segue actually to get Adam's perspective on this. Adam, you, in your role heading up the consultancy practice in Purple, working with a number of clients on this roadmap that Spencer was alluding to, and I just wondered, have you got any real life examples of how the customers and clients you're advising have been able to realize some of the benefits that Spencer's articulated, and also whether they're seeing the same drivers, and also whether they're consistent across the different industry types?
Yeah, I think certain things are consistent. So most times when I talk to customers, they're looking at, they kind of link it back to this idea of, does it make me money? Does it save me money? Or do I need to do it from a compliance reason? Like, they're kind of three fundamental reasons why change is introduced into the business. Now, for the most part, it's either the latter two there. So does it save me money, or do I have to do it from a compliance standpoint? Now, actually, I would also argue there's within that, does it save me money? There's also the aspect of improving user experience. What we're seeing mostly is that customers recognize that the legacy distributed set of kind of capabilities they've got actually isn't lending itself to a good user experience. So, while I think there are cost savings to be made by centralizing these capabilities into a single kind of SASE architecture, it's also revealing that actually user experience is a huge performance improvement. If we think about where users are and where they're accessing applications nowadays post-pandemic, it's anywhere, it's everywhere. I mean, the reality is that was still the same before the pandemic, but now we've just got it on a much larger scale. So whereas an organization might have had 20, 30% of their workforce who worked remotely on a regular basis prior to the pandemic, actually nowadays it's 80, 90%. I was in the office yesterday and there were 4 other people there. That's just, yeah, you were one of them, David, right? So, and that's just the reality, isn't it, nowadays? Yeah. So, I mean, I think, the ability for users to be able to work anywhere reliably is one of the key drivers. This idea that we have users accessing applications and services, funneled through either traditional on-premise security infrastructure to make sure that we can see it and we can inspect it and we can enforce policy. Those days are gone. The need to be able to secure users access to applications wherever they may be on any device is the need now. So that's a real driver. I think the other aspect as well is the need to remove on-premise hardware. I mentioned it already, and that again is driven by this idea that offices are going to get smaller, they're going to be spun up, spun down much faster as businesses need them in a much more flexible way. So having a full tech stack at a branch office, is just not feasible. Really what they want is a circuit to be provisioned into a branch site, a basic level of connectivity established to that location, and actually all the brains, inspection, security, and real network intelligence to be performed centrally. So I think that kind of SASE model again lends itself really well for customers to be able to decommission on-premise hardware, saving them money, saving them footprint, physical infrastructure footprint, and the green savings associated with that as well, right? So lots of drivers, in all honesty.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Adam. I think what resonated for me there was, and both of you have covered it really, around user experience. And when the audience is thinking about rolling out SASE, you articulated very well that it's a number of different technologies that are tied together into an architecture. But it's not just those technologies that you have to consider. It's what are the access rules to the particular applications? What are the policies around that? How does it integrate to your identity access management service and technology? How can you avoid a situation where a user is at home, their password expires, and they get sort of stuck in some sort of never-ending MFA revalidation loop? So all of these things are adjacent to SASE and an enabling factor of a successful SASE rollout, but they're not, strictly speaking, part of that SASE that you're buying. So from that perspective, it sounds quite complicated from a sort of an enterprise IT manager's point of view, as okay, how am I going to roll this out in a way that keeps things secure, allows me to develop to realize the benefits from SASE, but doesn't give a terrible user experience that just really puts a sort of a negative internal spin on this project. So probably again to Adam, just pulling out from the experience that you've just had there, what would you say are the key considerations for organizations when they're rolling out SASE to avoid that kind of negative perception from things like the never-ending MFA loop?
Yeah, it absolutely is important. So three things spring to my mind for this. Identity and access management. As you mentioned, identity and access management doesn't typically form a key building block of what is considered within SASE, but it's such a fundamental foundation of delivering a good SASE experience. From my experience, if you don't have a good IAM kind of foundation, actually that's where you kind of want to start. Not to say that you can't start your SASE journey without it, but it's going to improve your user experience and the capability of the platform, considerably by making sure you've got that, technology, people, and process around identity and access management. So I think that's the first thing to consider. Second thing to consider in my mind, and just from experience of going through these implementations and design processes with customers, is that integrating it into the wider business is essential. The reality is that this type of transformation for customers is considerable, and with significant transformation, the need to ensure that you bring the entire business on the journey with you is critical. If we are in a situation where we're not well communicating why we're doing this, what the benefits are, and the things that people need to think about, actually we're going to end up with a bad user experience, or users not considered that they're being brought along on the journey with us, and that's going to result in a negative impact. So making sure that key functions within the business, right from HR, finance, service management in particular, making sure that all of those teams are well across, how that affects their day-to-day role, what they do as a kind of in their normal day-to-day operations, and kind of things they need to think about. And then the third item for me really, again, is around that culture. So as change is starting to be introduced, what I've found a good example is, as we go through these types of migrations with customers, is that we find that the legacy components of their environment, the older technologies that they might have been using, as they're starting to be decommissioned, switched off, and transitioned to the new environment, actually there's a real user experience difference. So, for example, if I'm a user and accessing certain websites in my day-to-day role, previously I might not have seen certain alerts to make me aware of security threats or things to be mindful of. Whereas the new tool, may start to bring those alerts to the forefront for users. So they need to be aware of exactly what they mean, how to react to them, and what to do with them safely. So I think, user education and awareness and culture, generally security culture within the business, is the third point I think, is so important to get right as you go through one of these transformations. So I think if you get those three underpinning, a SASE design and implementation, you're really set for success as you go through it.
Thanks, Adam. Some three fantastic points there. Spencer, from a Paolo point of view, would you agree with Adam's assessment? And also from a technology set point of view, are there any things in the roadmap or things embedded within the technology that can help to alleviate and address some of those user experience concerns?
Yeah, I think that going through this process at the present, I think we understand. I think all understand that this is a huge shift. This is very transformational. But I think that in terms of what's really important is that we take a step back to reevaluate, right? In terms of look at currently how we think about access, or how we traditionally have thought about access, right? I think as one aspect of that. So think about how previously, we perhaps, I think, if we look at what we see as legacy, what we see as typical, is that users are having to access a data center in order to connect out to an application. So we understand that from a connectivity, that has, backhauling of traffic is bad. We know that there are productivity issues. We know that there are performance latency, all of that comes with it. And we've also seen a period of time where I kind of touched upon it earlier, is that we perhaps, when users were out of the office, they're perhaps given slightly more leeway. So, there were, in terms of the ability to basically turn off VPN, or there were allow rules that were given to certain applications or sites because of the very nature of a proxy architecture, not wanting to break traffic. So that again has left with some, I would say, long-standing issues that now need to be readdressed. Certainly when we think about the fact that, as Adam mentioned, that we've gone from 20% in terms of our workforce working from home to now actually something that's nearer 60, 70, 80%, depending on the time of the week, or perhaps season, let's say. So we have to think about in terms of what really, I don't want to sort of hammer on this, because I think everyone's banging on about zero trust, and there isn't. Let's be clear, there's not a product for zero trust, but it is, I think, something that we really need to think about how we can apply that moving forward, working, as Adam mentions, about culture, about process with people, technology. So I think that when we're thinking about SASE, to your question there, really, David, in terms of how we can intertwine, where do we start, where do we think about SASE and perhaps some of the other the ability to coexist, right? We need to think about that. But I think from a productivity standpoint, what we do have in terms of how we're supporting business within certainly our Prisma Access offering is the reduction of operational overhead. So the idea that if I raise a ticket, what we have seen typically is the time to remediate, the time to understand what actually the issue is. It could just be something as simple as that I'm sitting next to the microwave, or that I'm not near enough to my Wi-Fi router, right? And we can help identify that through synthetic testing via the agent on a device, right? And actually, therefore, we can also get as really granular as to look at application performance. And actually, what we have now got is that how we're utilizing AI to provide organizations with a much kind of intuitive approach, right? So actually where we do see perhaps performance issues to application, or perhaps where we can actually sort of provide without having to have human intervention for very general problems, right? And this is some of the stuff that we're trying to do to actually try and help business and organizations, you know, become ever more productive. Now that the idea of the branch site being, you know, a number of offices, it's now people's homes, right? And you've got perhaps almost management in terms of connectivity performance to however many thousands, right? We have to sort of start to provide and think about experience, but also how we can help IT teams to automate some of those responses and actively be proactive as to, you know, understanding where there will be issues arise because of perhaps lags in latency, connectivity, issues within applications themselves, wherever they reside. So hope I've perhaps also given a bit of a slight context and answer onto that as well.
Yeah. Spencer, I was going to say, I mean, I think that's a great point, and one actually we've sort of just started to touch on, I guess, is this idea that, you know, for most organizations, bringing SASE into their environment is a way of helping improve user performance, user experience. But actually, just by changing the architecture, by, you know, not tunneling traffic into a data center, or you know, using agents on devices to make sure users are secure, that kind of gets them there in terms of the architecture. But actually, there's another layer to that, isn't it? It's the ongoing monitoring and being able to react to when users are experiencing a problem. Now, I think, you know, what I've seen, you know, especially with working with Paolo, is their ability to interrogate, you know, users' performance and experience using capability that's all baked into that kind of Prisma SASE platform. And I think, you know, one thing that I think is really, really strong, especially for the service management and operational side of the business, is being able to see that, you know, when a user is turning around to the service desk and saying, hey, I'm struggling to access an application, or I'm failing to log in, or whatever the issue may be. Actually, before, where we were able to assure them that, you know, the network at the office, hopefully, touch wood, is performing as it's supposed to, you know, service desks and support teams now need the ability to, you know, troubleshoot home Wi-Fi networks. And that's just another added layer of complexity that has traditionally not been there, right? And you know, being able to get that insight to turn around to a user and say, do you know what, actually you're not able to log into this application, or you're getting a you know, degraded performance experience because your home router's not, you know, not performing as it's supposed to. You know, and I think that's just another level of insight that historically we've not had, and it's, you know, it's so important when we think about the ongoing monitoring, management, and, you know, operational overhead of deploying this type of architecture, right? So yeah, really good point.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think excellent points there. So I think we've established, you know, why all enterprises are moving in this direction, the convergence, the need for flexibility, need for consistency, that better user experience, given how everyone's more remote. So that's clear. And we talked about some of the how from a technical point of view, the importance of identity, technology, people, process, culture, and then some of the operational benefits and the tooling that's built into the new products. But from a kind of a monetary perspective and addressing that issue of technical debt, many organizations, and I'm sure there might be one or two on the call today, who spent a lot of money upgrading firewalls in a hurry, or infrastructure in a hurry, to keep businesses going in the pandemic a few years ago. Does that investment effectively need to be written off as part of this SASE journey, or is there a way that they can sort of stage the rollout and the implementation in a way that sweats that investment for longer, so that they can still get the benefits of SASE, but, you know, don't have to kind of write off a bunch of tech from the balance sheet? Yeah, but maybe Adam, if you want to pick that one up, because I know it's top of mind for a couple of customers you've dealt with.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess it depends on the benefits of introducing SASE. You know, if the productivity benefits of introducing SASE are clear and well defined, and actually for the business it makes a lot of sense. Actually, for them it might mean that writing off some investment in firewalls to gain those benefits or that competitive advantage might be worth it. And I guess that's the point, isn't it? When we go through our SASE quick start with customers to really start to understand, what's right for the business, what is it they're trying to achieve, and actually how is SASE going to help them along that way, along that journey. What we like to look at is, what are the tangible benefits to the business? Now, as we look at that, and as we start to draw out a roadmap and a plan for customers, there are definitely ways that we can turn around and say, do you know what, we've got a whole bunch of infrastructure here or a whole load of assets that we need to continue to sweat to get that return on investment that we've already made. And I think it's definitely not a case of, if you want to adopt SASE, you need to get rid of, these existing technologies. Actually, what I find is that most customers have those building blocks of SASE. It's just about joining them together in the right way. So an example might be that, yes, we want to ultimately get customers to, firewall as a service because it gives them benefits X, Y, and Z. But actually, if they've already made that investment, what we can turn around and start with is the SD-WAN part, is the secure gateway part, is the CASB part, is the DLP part. So it might be additional security capability on and above what those firewalls already deliver. And really, that's the benefit in the short term. I guess drawing out a roadmap and a plan for customers, all dependent on what the business objectives are. And I guess that's the key when we first start to work with organizations. It's mapping out what those key business drivers are, what their goals are, and importantly, how does that align to their strategy? And then how do the SASE blocks kind of join together to make that roadmap? So I think there's definitely ways that we, regardless of the situation, we can draw out a plan that helps customers along that way. I guess it's just about identifying what those are and making sure we're putting them in the right order so it makes sense for each customer. And, I guess the important thing is that each customer is different. I mean, you mentioned earlier, David, this idea that, are we seeing common trends across customers or industries? And I think some things we are, but the reality, like most IT and change that, we work in, each business is unique. They have their own priorities, agendas, and what they want to achieve in the short and long term, and that's predicated on so many different things that invariably most businesses are unique in what they want to try and achieve. But the building blocks in which they use to achieve that are the common aspects.
Yeah. So the building blocks are common. The direction of travel is common, but the order in which we can do things can be tailored depending upon the nuances within that business. So I think that's good to know.
Yeah, and the other thing to think about there is most businesses will have their own approach to security, and ultimately security is there to help reduce risk and enable the business. Now each business will have their own risk tolerance levels, right? So as we look at this, again, a key factor in determining what's a priority and how do we enable SASE is looking at it not only from a network consolidation standpoint, but from a security and a risk perspective, to say actually these are the benefits from a user experience or a cost saving perspective, but actually reducing risk is going to be a massive consideration as part of any business's plan to implement SASE. So I think again thinking about it purely with my security hat on, it's making sure that we understand where they want to get to, what their tolerance levels are, and making sure we're refining that plan to make sure it meets those needs.
Thanks, Adam. And Spencer, Paolo must get this challenge quite a lot. Customers, saying, "Oh, I only just bought a Paolo firewall or whatever firewall it is." You're trying to find something. How do you address that?
So it's interesting. And I mean, look, listen, it's a problem for everybody, right? Let's not understate it. You're right. The world has changed so rapidly, and you know, we've seen, let's be clear, we've seen, you know, I think there was a really good comment made recently, and someone said we've seen 10 years of network transformation into 3, you know, and I think that's true. I think we really have. And so you're right, there is tech debt, you know, that is associated. And I think one of the things is that we have seen is that, you know, perhaps now being 3 years down the line, what we are seeing with some of our own existing customers that are, you know, they built out their solutions on firewall, is that they're perhaps looking at maybe sort of augmenting the way that traffic is directed. So the idea that, let's say, for example, I have, you know, 15 firewalls sat across 15 branch sites, or they may sit in a HA pair for resiliency and redundancy reasons. But the idea that, let's say, you know, the current subscriptions that I've got on the device, I can allow them to expire. I may, as an organization now, because of my strategy to, let's say, to migrating application to cloud or refactoring to SaaS, look at perhaps augmenting some of my MPLS estate to, you know, internet circuit outbound. And therefore, perhaps what I'll do is I'll keep my firewall on site for east-west segmentation purposes. But what I will do is that I'll push that traffic out to the cloud and have the security and the, you know, the inspection delivery done from there, utilizing my internet circuit and breakout. And we're seeing a slight, you know, we're seeing customers that are getting slightly creative in terms of cost and currently what they have in terms of install base, and trying to sort of shift the way that security is delivered through kind of, you know, with the available budget that they have, and so that they're not adding, you know, or trying to perhaps do everything, you know, straight away, as in now, and adding sort of more debt, as it were, as you kind of say. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of to give you kind of one idea, and just to give you sort of what we are sort of seeing as sort of with our own existing base, a way that we are perhaps sort of seeing customers slightly, as I say, augment the way that network security is delivered.
Okay, brilliant. I think in terms of, you touched on it there, like how all the way through this, we've talked about the journey. We've talked about how there's an evolution. We've talked about, I think I like the 10 years worth of transformation in 3, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down. I was looking at the Microsoft 365 security roadmap the other day, and it was pretty impressive. I've had a few conversations now with organizations, primarily in the professional services space, where they, you know, they can see a position in not too far distant future, in a year or two's time, where they're entirely SaaS. They don't have any internally hosted applications, either, you know, on-prem or in any sort of private colo. They maybe have 1, possibly 2 applications that they put into Azure somewhere. And so they're kind of challenging this concept. You know, they're thinking, well, like you said at the start of the call, Spencer, you know, I'll have most of my workforce either at home or working from shared offices. They're accessing SaaS. Why do I need SASE? Why do I need to apply the same architecture? Can I kind of do everything that I need with simply endpoint security and some policy setting within my Azure AD or 365 suite? How would you respond to that? And yeah, what's Paolo's position?
Yeah, I mean, I think from our perspective, what you've got to remember is that if you look at the way perhaps we still, you know, provide security to data, to traffic, to users, and how we can provide policy, I still think that, you know, the idea that, for example, when you really sort of look at what we do in depth from a security perspective, so let's just take, for example, wildfire, you know, how we can perhaps, you know, send traffic for bare metal analysis, you know, disseminate that, look at, you know, the packet, understand whether or not that is malicious, whether what that is actually actively trying to do. Have we seen this before? Perhaps has it shifted slightly, in terms of the hash right at the end, and then provide a verdict to every single paying customer of Wildfire, within milliseconds. That is completely and utterly profound, in terms of the market today still, and so I can understand, we spoke about it in terms of consolidation being a driver, and Microsoft are taking more and more of that portion. But actually what we do still see is that, there is a requirement to provide, a high level of security efficacy. When you look at from a security perspective, and as I say, how we provide security, how we apply security to traffic, data, users, applications, and sites, it is, judged by independent analysts such as Gartner, such as Forrester, as still very much the market leader. So I still think that and how, if you go back to sort of where we first started as an organization, 2007, I think we kind of have really seen the application boom. We'd seen that in terms of how, traditional kind of security offerings really were unable perhaps to see past port and protocol. They couldn't see at the application layer. And then I think our ability to sort of move to layer 7 and then to provide consolidation at actually that point to, take the very premise of AV, sort of the whole IPS, IDS sandbox, and put that as a single pass architecture, really has helped us on our journey as we sort of move today to something, again, that's very application centric, user centric, but basically needs real-time security delivered. So I understand the question, but I would refer, as I say, back to our approach to security efficacy is what businesses are still very much looking for.
Thanks, Spencer. And Adam, from a vendor agnostic perspective, more of a kind of an architectural perspective, are you seeing this type of challenge and conversation coming up with other customers? And what's your approach from from an architectural perspective?
It's definitely part of the conversation. But I completely agree with Spencer on this one. I think historically and still today, there's this idea that, yes, Microsoft, as an example, has lots of capability that covers, the types of feature set that other vendors cover. But the reality is that under the hood, the deep dive, capability of that tool just isn't there in terms of, matching to the leaders in that space, and I just see that as a reality. I mean, if I cast my mind back even just sort of 5 years ago, when organizations were adopting Exchange Online, and most wanted to consume the kind of inbound scanning services that Exchange Online provide. But actually, what we were seeing in reality is most customers didn't trust that because it was still in its early days, and still to now, it's not as powerful as the leaders in that space, the Mimecasts, the Barracudas of the world. So they're still leaning on those kind of specific technologies to give their business that assurance that they're doing it right. Just switching on a secure web gateway is, the reality is it will tick a box in an audit. But actually, if you want to provide real assurance that it's protecting the business, that's when you're going to want confidence in the technology that's delivered as part of that.
Yeah, good. I think we've got agreement on that point then. So that's great. So we're coming into the last 10 minutes. Got one more question before we go to Q&A. So just a reminder for the audience: if you do have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A box. Any comments, observations, opinions, please put that into the chat, and we'll come to that in a couple of minutes time. So with that, in terms of wrapping up with, I guess, a call to action, some practical steps that you would recommend the audience to take. Let me start off with Spencer. Call to action, Spencer.
Yeah, really. So, I mean, I think really for me, I think I kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, that I think it's a really good period now to reevaluate, really kind of to look at kind of how we think about access, to think about, in terms of what, are our users and able to do today at home, working from anywhere, but perhaps they wouldn't do in the office. So how do we think about that? How do we think about the very premise of access? Now, given that we are in a very dispersed world, as we kind of said, there's still access to data centers, to cloud, to SaaS application. How do we think about connectivity in that respect, and the consistency and how do we apply, I think, what I would say, access in terms of what users are allowed to do within certain applications, right? This is something that's very sort of, we do as part of Prisma Access. I think that, how are we ensuring that we've got, DLP rules that are in place as well? So, one of the key benefactors for us is that we're able to look at traffic that's bi-directional. So not necessarily just, out to the web, but what we're also pulling back into the device as well, and actually onto perhaps the network. And how we are really, providing, security to the data at rest as well within CASB. We have something, I would say, from our security SaaS posture management, so we can absolutely help you in terms of looking at number of SaaS applications. We have over 90 applications that we can provide you with what is best practice in terms of posture to those applications, and customers are really pulling on that at the moment, certainly as seeing a greater sort of sense of utilization of SaaS. But I would also sort of think about as well, if you take a bit of time to speak to your IT operational teams as well, to sort of see what are the pressures that they currently have, how can we help or automate user experience issues and response times to perhaps free up and to perhaps give people the remit to do a little bit more in terms of the proactive stuff and not so much of the reactive stuff. How can we help turn that narrative to, so there are just a few things there. And I think we've also touched about, that what we see as the future of the branch. But what I would just sort of also really like to stress is just that, think about in terms of the aspect of partnership. We talk about infrastructure as a service. So key for us here at Palo Alto Networks is very critical to the relationship here that we have with Telstra. Our ability to be able to work hand in glove in terms of everything that you guys do, from let's say the early phase in terms of literally building that kind of utopia in terms of giving an architectural topology and a design that a customer could walk into, but yet take everything from that sort of piece within the demo, the proof of concept, proof of value, down to implementation and scheduling of all of that is so critical to us as a vendor to have such a good pair of hands in terms of yourself. So I think that just as a bit of an endorsement, do think about who you're working with on that journey as well, because I think that's a really, really important point, is the technology itself.
Thanks, Spencer. Really appreciate that. And I guess that's quite a nice segue, Adam, to yourself. So I think some of the call to action points that Spencer raised there around that reevaluation, discussion with the different stakeholders in the business, in the future of the branch. Some of these are aspects that I know you work with as part of a quick start package. So maybe you want to kind of talk to that and just reflect on some of those call to actions from Spencer.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think for most organizations, there's a number of compelling events to start the SASE conversation. And I guess whatever that might be, a refresh, end of life, looking to improve security, looking to drive cost savings, whatever those kind of early stage reasons are, that's a great time to start, thinking about what your strategy around SASE is going to be. And that's what we help customers define as part of our quick start. What we deliver as part of that is a rapid assessment of technology, people, and process, because the reality is not just tech, it's all of those pieces wrapped together to make sure it's a success. But really understanding, how the business is operating now from those three components, really what, as I mentioned earlier, what those business drivers are, what the goals are, and then we can start to work with you to say, do you know what, actually, you've already got some capability, but some investment over here in these areas are really going to help you along that pathway. So, we can look at it and turn around and say, look, there's some technology improvement here which is needed, along with some people and process uplift as well, to really get the benefit out of the technology. Unfortunately, I've seen examples of customers in the past who have kind of bolted for a technology, and the technology is great, in fairness to it, but actually the business is not ready to adopt it. So, what I want to make sure when I talk to customers is we get a good balance of all those things together. We can really unlock the power of the technology to drive those business improvements. So, yeah, I think, welcome those kinds of conversations, with any customer who's looking to start that journey. I think what we can bring to the table is a real wealth of expertise and experience, over the last sort of 5 years working with customers to start to develop this, and really help guide them on that pathway to success. So, yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, gentlemen. That's some fantastic insights and really, really valuable conversation and perspective. Just a reminder to anyone on the call, please post any questions that you have. I can't see any at the moment. But I will kick off with one of my own, which is something that I've been challenged with a few times from customers. Spencer, and you actually touched on it a little bit earlier around, the value that can still be extracted from on-prem firewalls for that east-west segmentation. There are certain providers, let's mention the F word, who have got a slightly different perspective on SASE in terms of putting a little bit more of that enforcement and control at the edge of the network rather than in the cloud, and using the cloud more for orchestration rather than enforcement. What's Paolo's view on that, and how can you kind of address that challenge of that concern about how to avoid that east-west threat perspective if all of your controls are off-prem in the cloud?
Yes, I mean, that's very much why we built our topology, our kind of model as it is, in terms of we, let's be absolutely fundamentally clear. Not every use case is I'm eating into my lunch here with my SASE hat on, but let's be very clear, there's not every use case is right for SASE. And there is absolutely still a requirement for on-prem firewalls, right? Let's be, we actively promote that. And actually, in some respects, I can give you some experience as well, actually, where we've actually sold, in some cases, more firewalls, right? Because of the fact that there is still, we talk about the nature of the branch site changing, but there are still instances where, as you rightly say, there is that sort of, threat within, and therefore you have to kind of provide security within. But what we're doing is just providing that additional layer of agility, flexibility, so we can provide what is the future in terms of, in terms of an architecture that basically where it is just perhaps a coffee shop, let's say, or just the notion of that, but yet we do understand, and that's where we can coexist, and that's where, for example, as I was mentioned to you earlier, is that we can have our firewalls on-prem, but yet still provide infrastructure as a service away from the actual device and into the cloud. So I wouldn't, from my perspective, I wouldn't devalue that use case in terms of the threat within and east-west traffic and segmentation. I still think it's really important. But what I would say is that I do think that we are giving a far more future way of thinking and looking and giving customers the ability and the agility to do what's right for the site and not necessarily.
I think
It's a bit more friendly to the environment. So a bit more friendly to the environment, and it not be full of, thousands of boxes. Sorry.
This is where we could do with those automation tools to find out if it's your home router or something else. Oh, we've lost your audio.
There we go. Apologies, but yeah, hopefully I got my message across there.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, thank you. And I think the other sort of follow on a related question around that is that the platform has still got the flexibility to be able to get that rule set consistency. So even if you did have, some on-prem firewalls for certain use cases, you can still kind of get that consistency through the orchestration platform.
Correct.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Just there's no questions or comments that has been raised. So I think we'll draw it to a close. Just want to thank you once again, Spencer and Adam, for the insight and the expertise you've shared. Really important. If any of the audience do think of any questions after the session or reflect on it, then please do get in touch with us, and we'll get back to you quickly. Similarly, if you want to have a deeper discussion around any of the topics that have been discussed, more than happy to start a workshop and go into that in some detail with you and your organization. And with that, thank you very much, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.